The news spread faster than Yuna could have imagined. Her broadcast had reached not just the 17 ships she knew about, but hundreds more as those crews shared her message with friends and family and colleagues across human space. And within days, the story of the alien girl who sought shelter with a human woman had become something much larger than one person's act of defiance. People were outraged not at Yuna, but at the Valorics and their ancient practice of abandoning children to die on frozen worlds for the crime of being different. Colonial authorities tried to suppress the story at first, citing diplomatic concerns and the importance of maintaining good relations with one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations. But the truth was already spreading too fast and too far to be contained. Human media networks picked up the broadcast and ran segments about Sari and Yuna, showing images of the small silver girl with her flickering markings and her silent dark eyes, asking viewers to consider what kind of universe allowed such cruelty to continue. Unchallenged politicians who had never cared about alien cultural practices suddenly found themselves being asked difficult questions by constituents who wanted answers. The pressure built for weeks until finally the human Colonial Authority issued a formal declaration granting Sari refugee status under the Displaced Persons Act, recognizing her as a sentient being with rights that superseded the cultural practices of her origin species. Yuna received the notification while sitting in her laboratory with Sari curled up beside her, both of them watching a nature documentary about the forests of Earth that Sari had become obsessed with over the past several weeks. "We did it," Yuna whispered, staring at the words on her screen. "You are officially protected, and no one can take you away now." Sari looked up at her and projected a feeling of such overwhelming joy that Yuna found herself laughing and crying at the same time, gathering the small girl into her arms and holding her close while tears streamed down her face. They were safe. After everything they had endured and everything they had risked, they were finally truly safe. The formal adoption took 3 more weeks to process, delayed by bureaucratic complications and legal questions about whether a human could actually become the legal guardian of an alien child. But eventually, the final documents arrived, and Yuna signed them with hands that trembled only slightly. Sari Park, that was her name now, officially registered in colonial databases and recognized across human space as the daughter of Dr. Yuna Park, xenobiologist and guardian of those who could not protect themselves. The research station felt different after that, warmer somehow despite the frozen wasteland outside, filled with the sounds of 2 people building a life together in the most unlikely of places. Sari learned to read and write in both Korean and Standard English, using tablet computers that she manipulated with surprising dexterity given her small fingers. And she began creating art that combined the mathematical precision of her Valoric's heritage with the emotional expressiveness she had learned from her human mother. Her patterns grew more complex and more beautiful every day, spiraling designs that seemed to capture something ineffable about the relationship between order and chaos, between logic and feeling, between the cold calculations of survival and the warm irrationality of lovey. Yuna's colleagues back on Earth began taking notice of her work, and requests for interviews and research collaborations started arriving with increasing frequency. But the message that changed everything came from an unexpected source. It arrived late one night when Sari was already asleep and Yuna was finishing her final data analysis for the day, appearing in her inbox with no sender identification and no subject line. The message contained only 2 things: a set of coordinates pointing to a planet in a distant sector of space, and a single sentence written in a dialect of Valorix that Yuna had to translate using her computer database. "There are others." Yuna stared at the screen for a long time, her mind racing through the implications of those 3 simple words. Other diminished children, abandoned on other frozen worlds, waiting to die alone because their people had decided they were not worth saving. She thought about Sari, sleeping peacefully in the next room with dreams, filled with forests and oceans, and all the beautiful things she had never known. Before meeting Yuna, she thought about Commander Tovan and his clutch sister Kira, who had been taken away and never spoken of again. She thought about all the children throughout Valoric's history who had been sacrificed to an ideology of purity that valued genetic perfection over individual lives, and she made a decision. The next morning, she sat down with Sari and showed her the message, explaining what it meant and what Yuna was thinking of doing about it. Sari listened with her usual quiet attention, her dark eyes fixed on her mother's face. And when Yuna finished speaking, the girl was silent for several long moments. Then she projected an emotion that Yuna had never felt from her before. It was courage, not the desperate courage of survival that had brought Sari to Yuna's door, but something deeper and stronger. The courage of someone who had been saved and now wanted to help save others. Sari reached out and touched Yuna's hand, and the meaning of the gesture was unmistakable. She wanted to help. She wanted to find the other diminished children and bring them to safety, to give them the same chance she had been given, to prove that the Valorics were wrong about everything they believed regarding the value of imperfect life. Yuna felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of pride. It will not be easy, she warned. There will be danger and difficulty, and we might fail more often than we succeed. Sari's markings flickered with determination, and she projected a feeling that needed no translation. She did not care about easy, she cared about right. Yuna pulled her daughter close and held her, feeling the steady beat of an alien heart against her chest, marveling at the strange path that had brought them together, a frozen world, a dying child, a single act of compassion that had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. Okay then, Yuna said softly. Let us get to work. Outside the station windows, the stars were shining bright and cold in the endless darkness of space, each one a sun around which orbited unknown worlds, where unknown stories were waiting to be written. Somewhere out there other children were waiting, other diminished ones, abandoned and alone, dying slowly on worlds where no one was supposed to find them. But someone was coming for them now, a human woman and her Valoric's daughter, carrying fire into the darkness, proving with every life they saved that compassion was stronger than tradition, and love was stronger than loss. Sari spoke her first word that evening. She had been practicing in secret for weeks, training her damaged vocal cords to produce sounds that should have been impossible for someone with her condition. And when she finally succeeded, her voice was rough and imperfect, but unmistakably clear. Home, she said, looking at Yuna with eyes full of love. Yuna smiled through her tears and pulled her daughter close. Yes, she whispered. This is home, and you are my daughter, and we are going to change the galaxy together. The research station hummed quietly around them, warm and bright against the frozen darkness outside. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, a message was already speeding toward Yuna's inbox. More coordinates, more children, more chances. To prove that humanity's greatest strength had never been technology or intelligence or military power. It had always been the simple, stubborn refusal to let the innocent suffer alone. Sari had come seeking shelter from the cold. Now she would help carry fire to others who were still waiting in the darkness, and that fire would never go out. Yuna spent the night sending messages. She broadcast on every frequency she could access, using the station's emergency transmitter to reach passing ships and distant colonies and anyone who might be listening to the endless chatter of space. She told Sari's story to anyone who would hear it, describing the child who had been left to die on a frozen world simply because her brain worked differently than others of her kind, explaining how she had found the girl collapsed at her door and nursed her back to health and watched Her create beautiful patterns with nothing but colored rocks and a mind that saw connections invisible to everyone. Else she did not ask for help directly, because she knew that colonial authorities would intercept any such request and shut her down. Immediately instead, she asked for witnesses. She asked for people to watch what happened next and remember it and tell others, so that the truth could not be buried beneath diplomatic protocols and convenient silences. By morning, her transmission had been picked up by 17 independent ships scattered across the sector, and 2 of them had actually altered course to approach the frozen planet and observe whatever was about to unfold. They were freighters, not warships, crewed by ordinary humans who hauled cargo between colonies and had no authority to intervene in diplomatic matters, but they were watching, and sometimes being watched was enough. Commander Tovan returned at midday with a full squad of soldiers instead of just 2. Their silver armor gleaming in the pale sunlight as they marched across the ice toward the research station. Una met them outside this time, standing alone in the bitter cold with nothing but her environmental suit between her and the elements. Sari waited inside, pressed against the observation window, with her dark eyes fixed on the scene unfolding below. "You have had time to reconsider," Tovan said as he approached. "I trust you have reached a more rational conclusion." "I have reached the same conclusion I had yesterday," Una replied. "Sari is under my protection, and I will not surrender her." Tarvan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. "My soldiers will enter your station and retrieve the diminished one by force, and you will face charges under the Galactic Accords for interfering with protected cultural practices. Before you do that," Una said calmly, "you should know that 17 human ships have received my broadcast explaining what is happening here, and 2 of them are currently in orbit observing this conversation, which means everything you do next will be witnessed and recorded and shared across human space." Torvin stopped walking. For the first time since their encounters began, genuine uncertainty flickered across his perfect features. "You broadcast this situation to your species," he said slowly, as if struggling to process the implications. "I told them the truth," Una said. "I told them that your people abandoned children who were born different, and that you came here to finish killing a little girl whose only crime was having a brain that works differently than yours." "This is an internal matter," Torvan said, his voice rising slightly. "Your species has no authority to observe or judge our practices." "Perhaps not," Una agreed. "But they can watch, and they can remember, and they can decide for themselves what kind of civilization murders its own children for the crime of being imperfect." She pointed toward the sky where the freighters hung in orbit, invisible to the naked eye but present nonetheless. "Those ships carry ordinary humans," she continued. "Workers and traders and families who have never met a Valorix before, and who are about to form their first impressions of your species based entirely on what happens in the next few minutes." Tovan stood frozen, his soldiers waiting behind him for orders that did not come. "Is this really the image you want humanity to carry of the Valorix?" Una asked, ancient and wise and sophisticated, marching in force against a single woman to take a frightened child, so you can kill her for being born wrong. "You do not understand our ways," Torvan said. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I understand that you have been doing this for thousands of years," Una said. "And I understand that old traditions can feel necessary, even when they are monstrous. But understanding is not the same as acceptance, and age is not the same as righteousness." She took a step toward him, closing the distance between them until she could see the subtle shifts of color in his bioluminescent markings. "Humans used to do terrible things too," she said quietly. "We abandoned the sick and the weak. We sacrificed children to gods we invented. We treated entire groups of our own people as less than human because of how they looked or where they were born." She met his eyes and held them. "We were wrong," she said. "And it took us thousands of years to realize it. But eventually, we learned that strength is not the same as cruelty, and that purity is not the same as worth." Torvald stared at her with an expression she could not read, his perfect face revealing nothing of the thoughts behind it. "Your species is young," he said finally. "You have not yet learned the harsh realities that force older civilizations to make difficult choices. Or maybe," Yuna replied, "we learned those lessons and decided to be better anyway." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind across the frozen landscape. Then Torvald did something unexpected. He dismissed his soldiers with a single gesture, sending them back toward the ship to wait at a distance. When they were gone, he turned back to Yuna. And when he spoke, his voice was different than before, lower and more uncertain and stripped of its official formality. "I had a clutch sister," he said, "long ago, when I was still young enough to believe that our ways were perfectly correct and eternally justified." Yuna waited, sensing that something important was happening beneath the surface of his words. "She was born with markings like the diminished one inside your station," Torvald continued. "Irregular and unpredictable, flickering when they should have been steady, indicating a neural pattern that did not match proper valoric standards." He looked away, toward the distant mountains that rose against the pale sky. "I was told she was defective and that her removal was necessary for the good of our family line. And I accepted this truth because everyone around me accepted it and because questioning such things was not permitted." His voice dropped even lower. "I never asked where they took her or what happened after she was gone, because I was afraid of what the answers might reveal about myself and my people." Yuna felt her heart constrict with unexpected sympathy for this cold and distant alien who had come to take Sari away. "What was her name?" she asked softly. Torvald was silent for a long moment. "Valorics do not name the diminished ones," he said. "We believe that naming something gives it value, and we are taught that the diminished have no value." He turned back to face her, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. "But I named her anyway," he admitted, "in the privacy of my own thoughts where no one could hear. I called her Kira because it means light in an ancient dialect that no one speaks anymore." Yuna reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that seemed to startle him. "Sari means lucky star," she said. "I gave her that name because she survived something that should have killed her, and because I believe she deserves every chance to shine." Torvald looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, then toward the station where Sari was watching through the window with wide, hopeful eyes. "If I take her," he said slowly, "she will die, and another child will be extinguished because our civilization decided long ago that certain lives are not worth living." "Yes," Yuna said simply. "If I leave her with you," he continued, "I will have failed my mission and violated the laws of my people and betrayed everything I was taught to believe." "Yes," Yuna said again. Torvald closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something had changed in their depths. "The biological material was deceased upon arrival," he said, his voice flat and official once more. "Exposure to the elements proved fatal before retrieval could be completed, and there was nothing left to recover." Yuna stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "That is what my report will say," Torvald continued. "And there will be no reason for the collective to investigate further because diminished ones die easily and frequently, and no one will question. Another routine loss." He turned away and began walking back toward his ship. "Commander," Yuna called after him. "Thank you." Torvald paused but did not look back. "Do not thank me," he said quietly. "I am simply correcting an error that should have been corrected long ago." He continued walking, and Yuna watched until he reached his ship and disappeared inside. And then she turned and ran toward the station where, Sari was waiting with joy and disbelief radiating from every flickering marking on her small silver body. They had won against all odds and all expectations. They had won. The Valoric ship descended through the morning sky like a blade of silver cutting through pale blue clouds. Elegant and terrible and utterly silent as it settled onto the frozen ground 300 meters from Yuna's research station. Yuna watched it land through her observation window, her jaw tight and her hands steady as she checked the environmental seals on the station. One final time she had disabled her communication systems during the night, cutting herself off from colonial headquarters and their demands for compliance. Knowing that this decision would likely end her career and possibly her freedom, she did not care. Some things mattered more than careers. Some things mattered more than following orders. Sari stood behind her, small and frightened, but refusing to hide, her dark eyes fixed on the ship that had come to take her away to the death. She had been meant to die weeks ago. Yuna turned and knelt in front of her, placing both hands on the girl's thin shoulders. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice calm and clear, even though her heart was racing. "No matter what happens in the next few hours, I need you to remember something important." Sari tilted her head and projected a question, her flickering markings reflecting the anxiety she could not hide. "You are not what they say you are," Yuna continued. "You are not broken or worthless or diminished. And you never were, and anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong, because I have seen the patterns you create and the way your mind works, and you are brilliant and beautiful, and you deserve every chance to live and grow and become whoever you want to be." Sari's eyes filled with something that looked almost like tears, though Yuna was not sure if Valorics could cry, and she projected an emotion so complex and overwhelming that Yuna could barely process it. Gratitude and fear and love and hope, all tangled together in a knot of feeling that spoke more clearly than any words could have. The airlock chimed with an incoming request for entry. Yuna stood and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at Sari one more time. "Stay behind me," she said, "and trust me." She opened the airlock. 3 Valorics stood in the entrance, tall and silver and radiating a cold authority that seemed to lower the temperature of the room. Simply by their presence, the one in front was clearly the leader, wearing elaborate robes that marked him as someone of significant rank, his bioluminescent patterns glowing with a steady perfection that indicated flawless genetics and high social status. "I am Commander Torvan of the Valoric's Diplomatic Corps," he said, his voice smooth and precise and completely devoid of emotion. "You are harboring biological material that belongs to the Valoric's collective, and I am here to reclaim it for proper disposal." "Her name is Sari," Yuna replied, "and she is not biological material, and she is not going anywhere with you." Torvan's expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes that might have been surprise. "You misunderstand the situation," he said slowly. "The diminished one has no value and no rights under Valoric's law, and your interference in our internal practices is a violation of the Galactic Non-Interference Accords that govern relations between species." "I understand the situation perfectly," Yuna said. "You abandoned a child on a frozen world and left her to die alone because she was born different. And now you want me to hand her over so you can finish the job." "It is not a matter of cruelty," Torvan explained, his tone suggesting he genuinely believed what he was saying. "It is a matter of efficiency and genetic purity, and the diminished one will never contribute anything of value to society. So it is kinder to end her existence quickly rather than allow her to suffer through a life of inadequacy and shame." Yuna felt her anger rising like a tide inside her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Kinder," she repeated. "You think killing children is kind. I think preventing suffering is kind," Torvan replied. "The diminished one cannot speak, and her neural patterns are irregular, and she will never form proper bonds with others of her kind. So what kind of life would she live, even if we allowed her to continue existing? She has already formed a bond, Una said quietly. With me. Torvald stared at her for a long moment. And for the first time, his perfect composure seemed to waver slightly. That is not possible, he said. Humans are an inferior species with primitive emotional responses, and a diminished one cannot form meaningful connections with anyone, let alone an alien from a young and backward civilization. And yet here we are, Una said. She trusts me, and I care about her. And I'm not going to let you take her, no matter what laws you cite or what threats you make. This is foolishness, Torvald said, his voice hardening. You risk your career and your freedom and your species' relationship with the Valorix Collective for the sake of a damaged child who would have been better off dead. No, Una said. I risk those things for the sake of a child who deserves to live. And if your civilization cannot see the difference between damaged and valuable, then perhaps your civilization is the one that is truly diminished. Silence filled the corridor. The two Valorix soldiers behind Torvald shifted uncomfortably. Clearly unused to hearing their commander addressed with such defiance, Torvald himself stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. But something in his eyes had changed in a way that Una could not quite identify. You do not understand what you are doing, he said finally. The consequences of defying the collective are severe, and your people will not thank you for creating a diplomatic incident over something so insignificant. She is not insignificant to me, Una said simply. And I would rather face consequences for protecting an innocent child than live with the knowledge that I handed her over to be killed because it was easier. Behind her, Sari stepped forward and stood beside Una, her small hand reaching out to grasp Una's fingers in a gesture of solidarity that made Torvald's eyes widen with something that looked almost like shock. The diminished one chooses to stay with you, he observed. She actively resists returning to proper Valorix custody. Her name is Sari, Una repeated. And yes, she chooses to stay with me because I am the first person in her entire life who has shown her kindness instead of cruelty. Torvald was silent for a long time, his gaze moving between Una and Sari, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that made no logical sense. I have my orders, he said finally, and I will fulfill them regardless of your objections. He gestured to his soldiers, who stepped forward with clear intent to take Sari by force. Una pushed Sari behind her and stood her ground, knowing she could not win a physical confrontation, but refusing to move anyway. Then you will have to go through me, she said. And I promise you that I will not make it easy. Torvald raised his hand and his soldiers stopped, confusion evident in their body language. You would die for this damaged child, he said. And there was something new in his voice, something that sounded almost like wonder. Without hesitation, Una replied. The commander stood motionless, his perfect face revealing nothing of the thoughts moving behind his dark eyes. And the moment stretched into an eternity of silence while the fate of one small girl hung in the balance. Then, Torvald did something unexpected. He turned away. We will return tomorrow, he said over his shoulder as he walked toward the airlock. I suggest you use the time to reconsider your position. The soldiers followed him in obvious confusion. And moments later, the silver ship rose into the sky and disappeared beyond the clouds, leaving Una and Sari alone. Once more, Una's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her whole body shaking with relief and residual fear. Sari knelt beside her and wrapped thin arms around her neck, projecting an emotion that needed no translation, love pure and unconditional and freely given, from a child who had never known such feelings before meeting the strange human woman who had refused to let her die. We are not safe yet, Una whispered. But we bought ourselves some time. She had one day to figure out how to save Sari from an ancient civilization that wanted her dead. She intended to use every minute of it 3 weeks had passed since Sari arrived at the research station. And in that time, Una had learned things about the Valorics that made her heart ache with a pain she could not describe. She had spent long hours searching through databases and academic archives, reading everything she could find about Valorics, culture and society, and the practices they considered normal and necessary for the survival of their species. What she discovered was monstrous. The Valorics called it the culling of the diminished, a tradition that stretched back thousands of years to a time when their homeworld was harsh and resources were scarce, and only the strongest could survive. Children born with defects or weaknesses were identified early and removed from society, taken to uninhabited worlds and left there to die alone so that their flawed genetics would not contaminate the purity of future generations. It was considered merciful by Valoric standards, a quiet ending rather than a lifetime of shame and suffering. And the families who surrendered their diminished children were praised for their sacrifice and their dedication to the greater good. Sari's irregular bioluminescent markings indicated a neurological condition that affected her ability to speak and process certain types of information. And among her people, this made her worthless. Her mother had carried her onto a transport ship and left her on this frozen world without a backward glance, fulfilling her duty to her species by disposing of a child who would never contribute anything of value. Una closed her computer screen and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall and trying to understand how any civilization could do such things to its own children. She could not understand it. She would never understand it, and she would never accept it. Sari was in the common room when Una finally emerged from her laboratory, sitting on the floor with a collection of colorful rocks that Una had gathered from the ice caves near the station. The girl had arranged them in patterns that seemed random at first, but revealed a strange mathematical beauty when Una looked more closely. Spirals and fractals that suggested a mind far more sophisticated than her people had given her credit for. Sari looked up when Una entered, and for the first time since her arrival, she did not flinch or try to hide. Instead, she projected an emotion directly into Una's consciousness, a sensation that felt like warmth and curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of trust. Una smiled and sat down on the floor beside her, picking up one of the rocks and turning it over in her hands while Sari watched with those large dark eyes. "These patterns are beautiful," Una said softly. "You have a gift for seeing connections that others might miss." Sari tilted her head and projected another emotion, this one tinged with confusion and disbelief, as if the concept of having a gift was entirely foreign to her understanding of herself. Una felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away and kept her voice steady. "I know what they told you about yourself," she said. "I know they made you believe you were broken and worthless and better off forgotten. But they were wrong about you, and I'm going to prove it." Sari stared at her for a long moment, and then she did something she had never done before. She reached out and touched Una's hand, just a light brush of silver fingers against brown skin, and she projected an emotion so powerful that it nearly knocked Una backward. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, and wrapped in layers of fear and doubt, but hope nonetheless, a tiny flame burning in the darkness of a heart that had never been given reason to believe in anything good. Una clasped Sari's hand gently and held it, letting her own emotions flow freely so that Sari could feel the warmth and determination and fierce protective love that had grown inside her over the past 3 weeks. "I am not going to let anyone hurt you again," Una promised. "Whatever happens, whatever comes, you are not alone anymore." They sat together in comfortable silence until the station's communication system suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Una stood and walked to the console, her heart beating faster as she recognized the frequency as belonging to her supervisor back at Colonial Headquarters. Dr. Park, the voice said, crisp and professional and utterly without warmth. We have received a formal inquiry from the Valorix Diplomatic Corps regarding biological material that may have been deposited on your planet several weeks ago, and we need you to clarify the situation immediately. Yuna's hands tightened into fists at her side's biological material. They were talking about Sari as if she were garbage, waste to be collected and disposed of. Not a living child with a brilliant mind and a heart that was just beginning to learn how to hope. There is a Valorix child at my station, Yuna said carefully. She was abandoned here and left to die, but I found her and I have been caring for her since her arrival. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when her supervisor spoke again, his voice was strained with barely concealed frustration. Dr. Park, the Valorix practice of diminishment is a protected cultural tradition under the Galactic Non-Interference Accords, and we are not authorized to intervene in the internal affairs of sovereign species. So I need you to cooperate with whatever retrieval process they require and allow this situation to resolve itself. Retrieval process, Yuna repeated, her voice flat and cold. You mean you want me to hand her over so they can finish what they started and let her die the way they intended? I mean, I want you to follow proper diplomatic protocols and avoid creating an incident that could damage relations between humanity and one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. Her supervisor snapped. This is not a debate, and this is not a request, Dr. Park. And I expect full compliance when the Valorix ship arrives tomorrow morning. The transmission ended abruptly. Leaving. Yuna standing alone in the suddenly silent room with her heart pounding and her mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. A Valorix ship was coming for Sari. They would take her away and they would kill her. Not with violence or cruelty, but with cold efficiency. Disposing of a damaged product that should never have been allowed to exist. Yuna turned and looked at Sari, who was still sitting on the floor with her colorful rocks, looking up at Yuna with an expression of concern as she sensed the turmoil of emotions churning inside the human woman. I am not going to let them take you, Yuna said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. I do not care what protocols they cite or what treaties they wave in my face, because you are a child and you deserve to live, and I will protect you with everything. I have Sari projected a question, a wordless inquiry about what would happen next and whether they would be safe. Yuna knelt down beside her and took both of her small silver hands in her own. I do not know what happens next, she admitted, but I know that I am not going to give up, and I am not going to stop fighting for you, because that is what humans do when someone they care about is in danger. Sari's bioluminescent markings flickered, and for just a moment they seemed to glow a little brighter than before outside the station. The storm had finally ended, and the stars were visible for the first time in weeks. Cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the small drama unfolding on the frozen world below, but inside the station there was warmth, and there was determination, and there was a human woman preparing to defy an ancient civilization for the sake of one small girl who had never been told she mattered. Tomorrow, the Valorix would come and Yuna Park would be ready. The storm had been raging for 3 days when Yuna Park heard the sound. It was not the wind, which screamed against the walls of her research station like a wounded animal. And it was not the ice that cracked and groaned beneath the frozen ground outside her windows. It was something else entirely, a soft thump against her outer door, followed by silence, followed by another thump even weaker than the first. Yuna set down her cup of synthetic coffee and listened carefully, her heart beating faster in her chest as the seconds passed without another sound reaching her ears. She had been alone on this frontier world for 6 weeks now, ever since her research team had rotated back to Earth for mandatory rest leave. And in all that time, she had never heard anything approach her station. The planet was supposed to be uninhabited. She stood slowly and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty. corridor that connected her living quarters to the main laboratory where she spent most of her days studying the strange microorganisms that live beneath. The iced environmental sensors showed the temperature outside had dropped to -40 degrees. Cold enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes. Cold enough to freeze flesh solid before a person could even feel the pain. Nothing should be alive out there. Nothing should be. Knocking on her door, Una activated the external camera and stared at the small screen mounted beside the airlock, expecting to see debris blown against her station by the wind or perhaps one of the large ice creatures that sometimes wandered too close to human settlements. What she saw instead made her gasp aloud. Child lay crumpled against her door, small and thin and utterly still, with silver skin that gleamed dully in the emergency lights that lined the station exterior. Una recognized the species immediately because she had studied them extensively during her training on Earth. Valorix were one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy, a proud and ancient people who valued logic and efficiency above all other things and who rarely interacted with younger species like humanity. They were tall and elegant creatures with silver skin and bioluminescent patterns that glowed along their arms and faces. Patterns that supposedly indicated health and genetic quality to other members of their kind. But this child was small, far smaller than any Valorix Una had ever seen in educational materials. And her bioluminescent markings flickered weakly and irregularly like dying embers in a forgotten fire. Una did not hesitate. She slammed her hand against the emergency override and threw open the inner airlock door, then waited the agonizing seconds it took for the outer door to cycle open and allow her to drag the frozen child inside. The girl weighed almost nothing in Una's arms, light as hollow bones and dried leaves, and her silver skin was cold to the touch in a way that frightened Una deeply. She carried the child to the medical bay and laid her on the examination table, then activated every heating element she could find while the station's basic medical systems began scanning the small body for signs of life. The girl was alive, barely, her vital signs so faint that a lesser scanner might have missed them entire. Una wrapped the child in thermal blankets and adjusted the room temperature upward, then sat beside the table and waited with her hands clasped tightly together and her eyes fixed on the small silver face. Hours passed before the girl opened her eyes. They were large and dark, those eyes like pools of ink that reflected the light of the medical bay in strange and shifting patterns. And when they focused on Una's face, they held an expression that Una would never forget. Fear pure and absolute terror. The kind that came from expecting pain rather than kindness. The kind that came from a lifetime of learning that the universe was cruel and cold and cared nothing for small, fragile things. The girl tried to move, tried to scramble away from Una and off the table, but her limbs were too weak and she collapsed back against the blankets with a sound that might have been a whimper. "It is okay," Una said softly, holding up her hands to show they were empty and meant no harm. "You are safe here, and I am not going to hurt you." The girl stared at her with those dark, terrified eyes and did not respond. Una would learn later that the child could not speak, that her vocal cords had never developed properly, and that she communicated instead through emotional projection, a secondary ability that most Valorix considered inferior to proper speech. But in that moment, all Una knew was that a frightened child had sought shelter at her door, and that she would do everything in her power to help. Over the next several days, the girl slowly regained her strength, eating the nutrient paste that Una offered and sleeping for long hours, wrapped in blankets that smelled like nothing she had ever known before. She flinched whenever Una moved too quickly, and she refused to eat unless Una turned away and pretended not to watch. As if the act of accepting food was somehow shameful or dangerous, Yuna named her Sari, a Korean name meaning lucky star, and she spoke to the child constantly. Even though Sari never answered with words, she told Sari about Earth and its blue oceans and green forests, about the family she had left behind to pursue her dream of exploring the stars, about the small things that made life beautiful, even in the darkest and coldest places, and slowly, so slowly that Yuna almost missed it happening. Sari began to listen when Yuna finally examined the tattered clothing that Sari had been wearing when she arrived. She found a small device hidden in an inner pocket, a beacon that broadcast a ship identification code and frequencies that only Valoric's technology could produce. The code led Yuna to a database of registered Valoric's vessels, and what she found there made her blood run. No Valoric ships had been reported missing in this sector of space. No search parties were looking for a lost child. No one was coming to bring Sari home. Yuna sat in her laboratory that night with the beacon in her hands and the truth settling into her heart like a stone dropped into deep water. Sari had not been lost. She had not wandered away from her family or been separated. During some terrible accident, she had been brought to this frozen, uninhabited world and left here deliberately, abandoned in the cold to die alone, because her markings flickered wrong and her voice did not work, and her people had decided she was not worth keeping. Yuna looked through the window toward the medical bay, where Sari slept peacefully for perhaps the first time in her short life, wrapped in warm blankets and dreaming dreams that Yuna could not imagine. And Yuna made a decision that would change everything. She would not let this child die. She would not let this cruelty stand unchallenged, whatever came next. Whatever forces tried to take Sari away from her, Yuna would fight with everything she had, because some things were worth fighting for, and some beings deserve protection simply because they existed and were afraid and had no one else to turn to. The Vindagene storm continued to rage outside, but inside the station there was warmth, and there was light, and there was a human woman who had chosen to stand between a broken child and a universe that had already hurt her far too much. This was what humans did. This was who humans were, and Sari, sleeping peacefully in the medical bay with a full stomach and warm blankets, was finally safe.